Miguel Santos adjusted his worn leather jacket as he merged into the morning crowd on Madison Avenue. 20 years of police work had taught him to blend in seamlessly, and today he looked like any other middle-aged man heading to work. His designer stubble and slightly wrinkled button-down shirt completed the illusion of a casual office worker, concealing his true identity as one of the department's most decorated detectives. The autumn air carried the aroma of fresh pastries from Carmen's bakery, mixing with the sounds of street vendors setting up their carts. Santos paused at a crosswalk, observing how Officer Reynolds managed the morning traffic. The young officer's interactions with pedestrians told stories that wouldn't appear in any official report. Santos had risen through the ranks the hard way, earning respect through diligence rather than politics. His latest assignment came directly from Commissioner Zhang: investigate a surge of complaints from the business district. The usual approach would have involved formal interviews and paperwork, but Santos preferred to see things firsthand. "Morning, sir," a street vendor called out, offering him a newspaper. Santos smiled, purchasing one to maintain his cover. The vendor, Mr. Kim, had been his informal source of neighborhood information for years. "Busy morning ahead?" Mr. Kim asked, expertly folding the paper. "Just another day at the office," Santos replied, maintaining his role. He tucked the paper under his arm, mentally noting how Officer Reynolds had just interrupted a group of teenagers rather abruptly. The kids weren't doing anything wrong, just laughing too loudly for Reynolds' comfort, apparently. The detective made his way toward Luna's coffee shop, his preferred observation post. The large windows offered a clear view of the street, and owner Isabella Luna always had a fresh cup of Colombian brew waiting. As he settled into his usual corner table, Santos pulled out his phone, appearing to check emails while actually documenting Reynolds' behavior. The morning crowd ebbed and flowed around him. Business executives hurried past with briefcases, construction workers gathered at food trucks, and tourists consulted their maps in confusion. Santos noticed how Reynolds' demeanor shifted depending on who he approached. His stance became more aggressive with certain groups, his hand resting too casually on his weapon. "Your usual, Mr. Santos." Isabella approached with a steaming cup, keeping her voice low. She was another pair of trusted eyes on the street, having witnessed countless interactions from behind her counter. "Thanks, Isabella. Anything interesting this morning?" He accepted the coffee, appearing to anyone watching as just another regular having a friendly chat with the barista. "Officer Reynolds made quite a scene yesterday," she murmured, pretending to wipe his table. A group of college students were studying outside, pre-med students from the university. He insisted they were loitering and threatened to write them up. Santos nodded slightly, adding this information to his mental file. The coffee shop's window offered a perfect view as Reynolds confronted a street musician about a permit. The officer's body language screamed intimidation, even from a distance. Checking his watch, Santos realized he'd been observing for nearly 2 hours. He had enough initial data to start building a pattern, but something told him to stay longer. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts. He ordered another coffee and continued his surveillance, watching as the business district's morning rush transformed into the steady flow of lunch hour. His phone buzzed, a text from Commissioner Zhang requesting an update. Santos typed a brief response, promising a preliminary report by evening. As he looked up from his phone, he noticed Reynolds becoming increasingly agitated with the growing lunch crowd. The officer's hand kept straying to his belt, his stance becoming more confrontational with each interaction. Santos knew he needed to wrap up soon, but first, he wanted to observe Reynolds' behavior up close. He gathered his things, preparing to walk past the officer's post. Sometimes the most telling observations came from direct, if brief, encounters. Little did he know, this decision would set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. Officer James Blake stood at his corner of 5th and Main, his polished badge catching the midday sun. The business district was his kingdom. At least that's how he saw it. 10 years on the force had taught him one thing: respect had to be earned through strength. His pressed uniform and rigid posture demanded attention from everyone who passed by. This morning's briefing still rang in his ears. Lieutenant Park had pulled him aside, mentioning another complaint about his approach to public interaction. Blake scoffed at the memory. These people didn't understand what it took to keep order on the streets. His arrest numbers spoke for themselves, highest in the precinct 3 years running. The lunch rush was starting, and crowds poured from the glass-walled office buildings. Blake watched them with narrowed eyes, particularly irritated today. A group of young professionals laughed too loudly for his liking, but he held back, not after the lieutenant's warning. Instead, he focused on a street vendor who'd set up too close to the crosswalk. "License and permit," Blake barked, approaching the elderly man's hot dog cart. Mr. Tanaka, who had operated this cart for 20 years, fumbled with his papers. Blake knew the vendor's documentation was perfect. It always was, but the show of authority made him feel better. "Here, Officer Blake," Mr. Tanaka said quietly, presenting his neatly organized permits. Blake made a show of inspecting each one, aware of the growing line of hungry customers. Let them wait. They needed to understand that order came before convenience. His radio crackled with reports of a minor fender bender 2 blocks over. Blake ignored it. Officer Rodriguez could handle that. This was his corner, his responsibility. He built a reputation here. Shop owners knew to call him directly about any problems, not the precinct's general line. The morning's tension lifted slightly as he spotted Maria Chen, owner of the corner bakery, waving him over. She always had a fresh coffee and pastry for him. At least some people still showed proper respect. Blake crossed the street, nodding curtly to pedestrians who scrambled out of his path. "Rough morning?" Maria asked, sliding his usual order across the counter. She was one of the few people who saw past his stern exterior, maybe because she reminded him of his mother. "Lieutenant's on my case again," Blake grumbled, accepting the coffee. "Can't do my job without someone complaining these days." He didn't mention the growing file of incidents in his personnel record or the mandatory sensitivity training he'd been ordered to attend. Through the bakery window, he spotted someone suspicious, a middle-aged man in a leather jacket loitering near the bank. The man was taking notes on his phone, occasionally glancing around. Blake's instincts flared. This was exactly the kind of behavior he was trained to question. "Excuse me, Maria," he said, setting down his half-finished coffee. "Duty calls." His boots clicked against the sidewalk as he approached the stranger. The man's casual attire didn't fool Blake. He'd seen enough undercover criminals to spot the signs. The way he observed the street, the careful note-taking, the calculated positioning near high-value targets. Blake's hand instinctively rested on his belt as he drew closer. The morning's frustrations crystallized into focus. Here was a chance to prove his worth, to show Lieutenant Park why his methods got results. The stranger reached into his jacket and Blake's training kicked in. Time seemed to slow. In his mind, Blake was already composing the report. Suspicious individual near financial institution refused to comply with officer commands, resisting arrest. His record would show another successful intervention, another threat neutralized. What Blake didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was that this moment would shatter his carefully constructed world. The man in the leather jacket wasn't a criminal casing the bank. He was about to learn a lesson about assumptions, about power, and about consequences, one that would change his life forever. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the sidewalk as Miguel Santos made his final notes outside Lin Chen's bustling noodle shop. The lunch rush had just ended, leaving behind the quiet hum of scattered conversations and distant traffic. His phone screen reflected the careful documentation of his morning observations, times, incidents, patterns of behavior that painted a troubling picture. A sudden movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Before Santos could fully turn, Officer Blake's commanding voice cut through the air. "You there. Hands where I can see them." The officer's stance was aggressive, his hand already resting on his belt. Santos remained calm, his decades of experience kicking in. "Good afternoon, officer," he said evenly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." The lunch crowd began to thin out, some pedestrians hurrying past, while others slowed to watch the scene unfold. "Put the phone down and place your hands on the wall," Blake demanded, closing the distance between them. His voice carried that edge of authority he perfected over years of street patrol, the same edge that had landed him in Lieutenant Park's office that morning. "Officer, I'm reaching for my credentials," Santos announced clearly, his right hand moving slowly toward his inner jacket pocket. The badge that would end this confrontation was just inches away. "I said hands on the wall." Blake's voice rose sharply. He grabbed Santos' wrist, yanking it away from the jacket. The detective's phone clattered to the ground, its screen cracking against the concrete. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly silent street. Mrs. Lynn appeared in her restaurant's doorway, her eyes wide with recognition. She knew Detective Santos from his regular visits, but before she could speak, events accelerated beyond control. Blake, interpreting Santos' continued calm statements as resistance, spun him around roughly. Santos maintained his professional composure, even as Blake's grip tightened painfully on his arm. "Officer, I'm Detective Miguel Santos from." The impact came without warning. Blake's strike caught Santos across the face, splitting his lip. A few droplets of blood splattered on his light blue shirt, creating a stark contrast against the fabric. Several onlookers gasped, and someone shouted about recording the incident. Santos didn't resist as Blake pushed him against the wall, beginning to recite Miranda rights with mechanical precision. Inside, the detective's mind was already cataloging every detail, every excessive use of force, every ignored attempt at de-escalation. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd faced similar treatment without a badge to protect them. Central, this is Officer Jin Park responding to the disturbance on 5th. A new voice crackled over Blake's radio. "I'm approaching from the east." The sound of quick footsteps announced her arrival. Officer Park rounded the corner at a brisk walk, then froze. Her eyes widened in recognition, and the color drained from her face. "Officer Blake, stop. That's Chief Inspector Santos from Special Investigations." Blake's hands went slack. The handcuffs he'd been about to apply slipped from his fingers, clattering against the sidewalk like a final punctuation mark to his career. The silence that followed was deafening. Santos straightened his jacket slowly, maintaining his dignity despite his split lip. A small crowd had gathered, phones raised, to capture the moment. Mrs. Lynn emerged from her shop with a clean white towel and a look of concern. "Thank you, Officer Park," Santos said quietly, accepting the towel to dab at his lip. He turned to face Blake, whose expression had transformed from authority to dawning horror. "As I was trying to tell you, I'm Detective Santos. I believe we have some things to discuss." He paused, glancing at his cracked phone on the ground. "First thing tomorrow morning, my office. 8 a.m. sharp." Blake stood rooted to the spot, his entire world crumbling around him as the full implications of his actions began to sink in. The street had gone completely silent, the only sound the gentle fluttering of Mrs. Lynn's awning in the afternoon breeze. Officer Jin Park took control of the scene with practiced efficiency, though her hands trembled slightly as she dispersed the gathering crowd. Every few seconds, her eyes darted between Detective Santos, who sat calmly at one of Mrs. Lynn's outdoor tables, and Officer Blake, who stood frozen in place like a statue in uniform. "The situation is under control," Park announced to the onlookers, her voice steady despite the chaos churning in her stomach. She'd worked with Blake for 3 years and had witnessed his aggressive tendencies, but this was different. This was career-ending. Mrs. Lynn bustled around Santos with grandmother-like concern, pressing a bag of ice wrapped in a clean kitchen towel against his swollen lip. She spoke rapidly in Mandarin, switching occasionally to English to scold Blake, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past 5 minutes. "Detective, sir." Park approached Santos, her notebook ready. "Would you like to make a formal statement?" She tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but her voice caught slightly. Every officer in the department knew Miguel Santos. His reputation for fairness was legendary. Santos checked his cracked phone, somehow still functional. "Not at the moment, "Officer Park," he replied, his words slightly muffled by the ice pack. "But I will need your body camera footage." He glanced meaningfully at Blake's camera as well. Both cameras. Blake finally moved, his hand automatically reaching for his chest-mounted camera. The red recording light blinked steadily, having captured everything. His other hand still rested on his belt, a habit now seeming more like a nervous tic than a show of authority. "Officer Blakes," Santos called out, his tone remarkably gentle for someone with a split lip. "Please sit down before you fall down." It wasn't an order, but Blake complied as if it were, sinking into a chair at the farthest table. The lunch crowd had completely dispersed, leaving an unusual quiet on the normally bustling street. Mr. Tanaka, the hot dog vendor, wheeled his cart closer, offering free drinks to the officers. Park accepted a water bottle gratefully, while Blake stared straight ahead, unseeing. Santos' phone buzzed. Lieutenant Park, no relation to Officer Jin Park, was calling. "Yes, sir," Santos answered, his professional tone unchanged. "No, sir, I don't need medical attention." "Yes, I believe we found our starting point for the investigation." He paused, listening. "No, I don't think that will be necessary. I plan to handle this personally." Blake's head snapped up at those words, fear finally breaking through his shocked expression. Everyone knew what handling it personally meant when it came to Detective Santos. His investigations were thorough, meticulous, and invariably career-changing for those involved. Mrs. Lin returned with a fresh pot of tea, muttering about bad karma and losing face. She had known Santos for years. He'd helped her nephew with a minor legal issue, treating the young man with respect when other officers had dismissed him. "Officer Park," Santos said, setting down his phone. "Please ensure all relevant footage is preserved. I'll need witness statements from Mrs. Lin and Mr. Tanaka as well." He stood slowly, straightening his jacket. "And Officer Blake." Blake looked up, his face a mask of dread. "8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring your union representative if you wish." Santos picked up his cracked phone, examining it thoughtfully. "Sometimes our worst mistakes become our greatest teachers. It depends on what we learn from them." As Santos walked away, Officer Park noticed something strange. Despite everything that had happened, the detective's steps were light, almost purposeful. It was as if he'd been waiting for something like this, a catalyst, a moment that could force real change. Blake remained seated, staring at his hands. His carefully constructed world of authority and control had shattered, leaving him with the one thing he'd always feared: the consequences of his own actions. Detective Santos sat in his office, surrounded by digital screens displaying footage from various body cameras. His split lip had started to heal, but the real wound, the one that demanded justice, ran much deeper. Officer Yuki Tanaka stood before his desk, fidgeting with her badge as she watched footage of Blake's previous encounters. "I should have reported it sooner," Tanaka said, her voice steady despite her nervous hands. "Last month, outside Marco's Pizza, Blake twisted this teenager's arm so hard." She pointed to one screen where Blake could be seen forcing a young man against a wall. The kid was just skating home from school. Santos nodded, adding another note to his growing file. "Why didn't you report it then?" His tone held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. He'd learned long ago that understanding motivations was as important as gathering evidence. "You know how it is, sir. Blake has friends in high places. Lieutenant Rodriguez has always backed him up, said he was just being thorough." Tanaka's fingers finally stilled. "But after what happened to you, I can't stay quiet anymore." The door opened and Officer Jin Park entered with a stack of files. "Found something interesting in the archived complaints, sir. 3 years ago, a business owner named James Kim filed a harassment report against Blake. It disappeared from the system 2 days later." Santos leaned back, connecting invisible dots. Kim, the newspaper vendor from Madison Avenue. The same man who'd been his eyes and ears on the street for years. "Bring him in." Carefully. As Park left, Santos' phone buzzed with a text from Maria Chen, the bakery owner who'd always seemed friendly with Blake. "I need to tell you something," It read, "Not over the phone." The investigation was breaking the code of silence faster than Santos had anticipated. Each revelation painted a darker picture of abusive power and protected misconduct. His computer pinged with a new email, footage from traffic cameras showing Blake's confrontations over the past 6 months. Officer Tanaka remained standing, something clearly still on her mind. "Sir, there's more. I have personal recordings, conversations in the locker room. Blake bragging about teaching lessons to people who disrespected him." Santos raised an eyebrow. "Those recordings weren't officially sanctioned." "No, sir. I started keeping them after Blake threatened my brother outside his restaurant. Just in case." She placed a small USB drive on the desk. "I know it might not be admissible, but it tells us where to look," Santos finished, understanding perfectly. He built cases on less. "Officer Tanaka, what you're doing takes courage." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his office as more officers came forward. Each carried a piece of the puzzle: deleted reports, overlooked complaints, witnessed incidents swept under the rug. The wall of silence was crumbling, replaced by a wave of long-suppressed conscience. Santos' assistant entered with another update. "Sir, Officer Rodriguez just requested a meeting. Says he has information about Lieutenant Martinez's involvement in covering up complaints against Blake." The detective nodded, adding another thread to the complex web displayed on his investigation board. What had started as a single incident was revealing a systemic failure of oversight and accountability. His phone buzzed again. Commissioner Zhang requesting an update. Santos looked at the evidence wall, where photos, reports, and testimony painted a damning picture. "Tell him I'll need a larger team," he told his assistant, "and clear my schedule for the next week." As the sun set over the city, Santos stood at his window, watching officers change shifts in the parking lot below. His split lip had almost healed, but the impact of that encounter continued to ripple through the department. Tomorrow, he would interview Blake again, armed with evidence the officer didn't know existed. Sometimes, Santos reflected, it took one moment of truth to bring down years of lies. Officer Blake sat rigid in the chair facing Santos' desk, his uniform perfectly pressed, but his eyes revealing sleepless nights. The morning sun streamed through the office windows, illuminating the evidence boards that now covered every wall. His union representative, Mr. Fujimoto, sat beside him, reviewing documents with increasing concern. "Let's begin with the incident at Marco's Pizza," Santos said quietly, pressing play on one of the screens. Blake watched himself on the monitor, seeing his actions through new eyes. The teenager's skateboard clattered to the ground as Blake grabbed his arm. The audio was crystal clear. "Respect the badge, kid." "I was following protocol for suspicious behavior," Blake said automatically, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Mr. Fujimoto placed a warning hand on his arm. Santos nodded, switching to another video. "And this incident outside Golden Dragon restaurant?" The footage showed Blake confronting Officer Tanaka's brother. Was this protocol as well? Blake's jaw tightened. He remembered that day. He'd been angry about a minor traffic violation, and the restaurant owner had talked back to him. Now, watching the playback, he saw something different. A business owner politely explaining that his delivery truck would move in 5 minutes. "Detective Santos," Mr. Fujimoto interjected, "my client acknowledges there may have been some overzealous moments in performing his duties." Santos pressed another button, and Maria Chen's voice filled the room. The bakery owner, who'd always been kind to Blake, was describing how she felt compelled to give him free coffee and pastries, afraid of what might happen if she refused. The recording hit Blake like a physical blow. "You built quite a system," Santos observed, his healed lip barely showing a scar. Free meals, special treatment, looking the other way when certain officers covered up complaints. He spread photographs across the desk. Blake with Lieutenant Rodriguez, with senior officers who'd protected him, all taken from security cameras. Blake's carefully constructed defenses began to crumble. "I was just trying to maintain order," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "The streets need a firm hand." The streets need justice. Santos corrected gently. Not fear. He played one final video, the confrontation with Santos himself, but from multiple angles. Blake watched himself strike a man who was clearly trying to identify himself as law enforcement. Mr. Fujimoto cleared his throat. Detective, given the circumstances, we'd like to discuss options for. A knock interrupted him. Officer Jin Park entered with a tablet. Sir, we have new statements. 3 more business owners have come forward about similar incidents. Blake slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally crushing his rigid posture. The evidence surrounded him. Years of complaints, testimonies from fellow officers, surveillance footage, deleted reports mysteriously recovered. His kingdom of fear had crumbled to dust. Officer Blake Santos said, his tone surprisingly compassionate, "You have a choice to make. The easy path is to fight these charges, claim you were just doing your job, hope your connections protect you. The harder path." He paused, letting the words sink in. The harder path is to acknowledge what went wrong and be part of the solution. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of computer fans. Through the window, Blake could see the street where he patrolled for years, where he convinced himself that respect and fear were the same thing. He watched ordinary citizens going about their day, the same people he'd sworn to protect and serve. Blake's voice cracked. He looked at the evidence board, at his own face captured in moments of unchecked power. I want to make this right. Santos nodded slowly, reaching for a new folder. Then let's talk about what that looks like. The morning sun caught the badge on his desk, a reminder of what it truly meant to serve and protect. The small conference room felt different today. Blake sat across from Santos, but gone were the formal barriers of rank and circumstance. Both men wore civilian clothes. Blake's first time out of uniform in weeks. A cup of tea from Mrs. Lin's shop sat untouched before each of them. Tell me about your first year on the force, Santos said, his tone conversational. The evidence boards and official documents were absent, replaced by a more personal atmosphere. Through the window, afternoon light painted patterns on the table between them. Blake stared into his tea, remembering. I wanted to make a difference, he said quietly. My father was a beat cop in Oakland. He always said respect was everything. His fingers traced the rim of the cup. Somewhere along the way, I confused respect with fear. Santos nodded, letting the silence stretch comfortably. In the 2 weeks since their confrontation, he'd seen something change in Blake, a crack in the armor that might lead to real growth. I visited Marco's Pizza yesterday. Blake continued unprompted. The kid with the skateboard, his name is David. He works there part-time, saving for college. His voice caught. He flinched when he saw me. I did that. I made a kid afraid to walk in his own neighborhood. Outside, the sounds of the city drifted up. Traffic, conversations, the normal rhythm of life. Santos had chosen this room specifically for its view of the street below, where officers and civilians interacted in countless small ways. Your record before the incidents started was excellent, Santos observed. What changed? Blake's hands tightened around his cup. Power, I guess. Each time I pushed and nothing pushed back, it got easier. The free coffee, the special treatment. It felt like respect, but it was just fear. He looked up, meeting Santos' eyes. The day I struck you, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just angry. At what? Everything. The complaints, the warnings, feeling like the job was slipping away. Blake stood, walking to the window, but mostly at myself. Every time I put on the uniform, I felt less like my father's son and more like a bully with a badge. Santos finished gently. Blake's shoulders sagged. Yeah. Santos joined him at the window. Below, Officer Tanaka was helping an elderly woman cross the street, both of them smiling. You know what I see when I look down there? He asked. I see thousands of chances every day to either build trust or destroy it. I destroyed a lot of trust, Blake acknowledged. Trust can be rebuilt, Santos replied, but it takes time, honesty, and hard work. He turned to face Blake. The review board meets tomorrow. They'll want to know if you're worth giving a second chance. Blake watched Officer Park help a lost tourist with directions, her body language open and friendly. "How do you do it?" he asked suddenly. "Stay balanced, keep the authority without losing the humanity." Santos smiled slightly. "By remembering that the badge doesn't give us power, it gives us responsibility. Every person we meet is someone's David, someone's Mrs. Lynn, someone's brother or sister." A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Tanaka entered with a folder. "Sir, the statements you requested from the community feedback sessions." Blake straightened, facing her. "Officer Tanaka, I owe you an apology. What I did to your brother, there's no excuse." Tanaka paused, studying him. The fear she'd once felt was replaced by cautious recognition of something changing. "No, there isn't," she agreed. "But what matters is what you do next." As she left, Blake returned to his seat, finally picking up his tea. "I want to make it right," he said, echoing his words from 2 weeks ago. But this time, they carried the weight of understanding rather than desperation. 1 year later, the police academy auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as new recruits filled the seats. At the podium, Commissioner Santos adjusted his tie, scanning the fresh faces before him. In the front row, Captain Rosa Martinez nodded slightly. Their shared vision for departmental reform was taking shape. "Today's lesson is different," Blake announced, stepping onto the stage. No longer in patrol blue, he wore the plain clothes of a training instructor. The recruits sat straighter. They'd all heard stories about the former officer who'd become an unexpected agent of change. "A year ago, I stood where Detective Santos is standing now," Blake began, his voice carrying to the back row. "But I was a different person then. I was giving a speech about authority, about control." He paused, making eye contact with several recruits. "I was wrong." The screen behind him lit up with body camera footage, not the confrontation with Santos, but everyday interactions. Officers helping elderly residents, diffusing tense situations with words instead of force, building trust one small action at a time. "These are your real tools," Blake said, gesturing to the screen. "Not your badge, not your uniform, not your authority. Understanding. Empathy. The courage to admit when you're wrong." In the back of the room, Officers Jin Park and Yuki Tanaka watched with professional interest. Their new roles as community liaison officers had grown from the changes Blake's case had sparked. Park's weekly meetings with local business owners had replaced fear with partnership. "Mr. Kim still sets up his newspaper stand on Madison Avenue," Blake continued, pacing slowly. "Mrs. Lynn still makes the best noodles in the city. David, the kid I once terrorized for skateboarding, just started pre-med at the State University." He stopped, letting that sink in. "They're not just citizens we police. They're the community we serve." Commissioner Santos stepped forward. "Officer Blake's story isn't unique. Power can change us, harden us, make us forget why we chose this profession." He gestured to the screen, now showing statistics on community trust and police effectiveness. "But change is possible. Growth is possible." Through the auditorium windows, afternoon sun illuminated the street where everything had changed a year ago. The business district looked the same, but felt different. Shop owners greeted officers by name. Kids on skateboards no longer scattered at the sight of a uniform. "Your training includes tactical skills, legal knowledge, physical preparation," Blake addressed the recruits. "But the most important lesson is this. Every interaction is a chance to build trust or break it. Choose wisely." After the session, Blake gathered his materials as the recruits filed out. A young woman approached. Officer Martinez's daughter, Elena, newly graduated from the academy. "Is it true?" she asked. "About Detective Santos giving you a second chance." Blake nodded, remembering that morning in Santos' office. He saw something worth saving. But the real second chance came from the community, from every person who was willing to trust again, to believe people can change. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm. Officer Park helped Mr. Tanaka set up his hot dog cart, their morning ritual now including friendly conversation. Officer Tanaka emerged from Golden Dragon, carrying lunch for her team's community meeting. Commissioner Santos watched from his new office window, satisfaction evident in his expression. The department's latest community satisfaction surveys showed significant improvement. More importantly, officers were building genuine connections with the people they served. Blake's phone buzzed, a message from David, the pre-med student. Guess who's doing their rotation at the police medical unit? Attached to a smiling selfie in hospital scrubs. As Blake typed a congratulatory reply, he caught his reflection in the window. The man looking back wasn't the angry officer from a year ago, but someone who'd learned that true strength lies not in demanding respect, but in earning it, one interaction at a time.